CS12, welcome to day 2 of React Week 2. This week we're building the React Instaclone. Today we're going to talk about the React component lifecycle. But before we dive in, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of review / overview of what you could have accomplished on day 1 if you completed all of the steps from the README. So if you didn't finish everything from day 1, to this degree, I want you to start there where you left off this afternoon, okay? So this is a day where things are a little bit more trivial to implement, and we have a little bit more of a complicated task at hand to work through today. But if you kind of follow along and pay attention this morning, this afternoon might go a little bit smoother for you for the assignments for the daily tasks for the afternoon. So we're going to go over a couple of cool things today. But first, let's just dive in for this morning's solution. Make sure you're asking questions and commenting in the questions and answers thread, because I'm suspicious as to why we have a lack of participants right now in our meeting. And I think it's because that link is already lost in the channel above. So I'm going to go ahead and just remind people that we're in this meeting, okay? All right, so initially you were given a blank slate. The idea yesterday was to use Create React App to build your component from scratch. Given this blank slate, you had to make some architectural decisions. We pointed you and steered you in a direction through the README that sort of allowed you to build and architect your app in a certain way. So that way was to basically treat your app component as sort of your overarching component. That's usually kind of what we do. And then everything that's a child of this component will be, or everything that you put into this component will be a child. So this is like the most parent component that you have is your app component. This component's job is to hold on to your state data, the dummy data that we give you for this application, and to set that array of objects on state as posts, okay? And then we're gonna wrap search bar and post container as children of our app component, okay? Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Awesome, Kyle, go for it. If you don't assign it to posts, is that okay? Yes, this doesn't have to be called posts. This could be called whatever you want it to be called. Each one of these is an Instagram post. That's why I called it posts. Or if you just pass this down as an array, that's gonna be troublesome for you. So I want you to make sure you go and refactor it so that you actually put it on state, because we're gonna be updating the state object. And the way that we update the state object is through which method? This.setState. So when we call setState, what happens to our render function? It re-renders. So because of that, you need this to be on state, okay? Because if you're just passing data from a file as a reference to an array, and then you're updating that array, you're not going to get the reactivity that you want. So you need to put this on state. So that's one thing you'll have to go and refactor this morning. Just make sure you pull your dummy data, put it on state, and then change that one line. And that's virtually it, okay? Kyle asked, so when I went ahead and did the map to the post container, with the app render method, is that non-idiomatic compared to how you did it? Yeah, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the post container to simply be a container component. And then that's going to, there is gonna be a map function. We're gonna map over that data, returning a new array of post components. So we'll get there in just a minute. So with Kyle, he said this.state.dummy.map, and then you created a new post container for each version. That's totally fine. You could have done that. It really just, the architectural decision is completely up to you there. I'll go into post container. That'll be my next step. If there is only one object on state, why can't we do this dot state equals dummy data? Because dummy data is an array of objects. And our state object should be just an object literal so that we can reference it. If you were to set it up that way, Mike, with this dot state equals dummy data, when you're going to go and update it, what are you going to do with your set state? You're just going to return state like this. That'd work because you're just going to replace state altogether. But it's not. That's an architectural flaw because eventually you're going to have potentially there'll be more items here, especially when you're working on the search filter this afternoon. You're going to need to have your posts and another object of filtered posts. So that way you don't override the existing object, right? And this would be an array, right? This is an array, but you're going to, when you search for something, you're going to have to loop over this data and then you're going to assign it to this. So you're going to need to slice it up like that. Gotcha. So you make sure that, just making sure that you're using, key value pairs, because when you set state, you need to tell set state what portion of the state you want sliced and reset. All right, Kyle, we're going to dig in right now. Search bar right now is only just a simple static component. This will change in the future for me based on a couple of things. One of them being this input field should be managed in its own component somewhere, potentially, right? But yeah, for me right now, search bar doesn't take in any props. It's just mounting DOM elements just to get this component right here on the screen. Cool. Okay. So that's all search bar is. It's just a bunch of styled elements akin to, just HTML. It looks just like HTML. Okay. Now, post container. This is where things use the interesting pattern of React. Okay. I am using post container to simply pass my props to. Okay. So my props are going to be my posts. So I'm going to get an array of posts here. Now I'm just simply using this container component to iterate over that list of items and give me a new array of post components. Okay. And then I'm using the key as the image URL because it's unique. So I'm going to use the key there as the image URL. So that way it's a little bit easier to deal with and maintain. And instead of trying to find an index or whatever. And remember that P right here, it could be whatever I want it to be. It represents a post. I just like, when I use my map functions, I just use a single letter. A lot of people don't like that I do that. Some people in the industry would say you should be more semantic, but for me, it's just a fast way of saying, oh, for each P, for each post, give me that item. And then I just give the post image URL as the key, and then I pass the entire object to my post component through props. Okay? Okay, here's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Let's go there. Let's go to post. And notice that post is taking in props, and it's mounting a post header. This div, which is sort of the image, okay? So the post header would be this component right here. Somebody's making fun of my drawings yesterday in feedback. This component right here would be our post header. Then this component right here is going to be this stuff, right? And then we have this comment section, which is a part of every single post. Okay. At this point, what I have done is let's say that app exists. App is our outer component of everything, right? So Instagram, or this header right here, lives inside of app, and then our posts live inside of app as well. This has our state data, right? This is our post data. Just put P right there. some array of ideas. Okay, so for each item in this array, give me a post. That's kind of what's going on here. Okay, so I now have an architectural dilemma where I'm going to be building this comment section. You're going to be working on this today to add comments to your posts. And here's the dilemma. Comment section is a child of posts, which is a child of app, right? Or post container, which is a child of app. Okay, so this is kind of like our chain here. So we have app, which controls our data, post container, posts, and comments. That's a lot of passing props around. If I need to manage my comments for each comment up here in app, I'm going to need to pass an event handler down 1, 2, 3 places. Okay, that's 4 components where something could go wrong. So here's my architectural pattern that I chose to take. And I recommend you doing the same. In fact, there will be a prompt for you to do the same inside of the README today. Okay? So comment section will take in an array of comments because, remember, each post in our dummy data each post is an object and it has an array of comments for each post. Okay? Now, once again, if we are managing all of this data up on top of app, then we're going to have to pass event handlers all the way down the props chain. Okay? 3 or 4 components deep. So what does Ryan do when he sees something like this and he starts to take a little bit more architectural liberty? Well, Ryan would separate that comments data that get fed to this comment section as props. Okay, let me pull those up side by side so you can see. Post. Okay. So comment section right here takes comments as props from each post. Okay. Then this is the thing that we're mounting is this comment section, this component. So we pass those props through our constructor, and then when we initialize this constructor, we just set them on state. Okay, this may be a little bit of a reach, but why would I want to do this? I've sort of hinted at it, but I'm curious if any of you know, why would I want to do something like this? In fact, before you answer, I want everyone to think about it for 30 seconds. So no answers, I'll tell you when you can answer. Start typing out your thoughts. Think about it. Why would I separate the comments that are being passed on this as props and put them on state? What does that benefit me in the long run? Okay, go ahead and send your answers. Okay, Jonathan says to add comments later and render with this .state. You can change state, aka add comments to the post. Yeah, that's what Jordan said. Trevor said, I think eventually each CAD is going to need its own state so that new comments can be unique to itself. Yes. And then Rodrigo says it will be updated on input. Yep. So that new comments can appear and update the state. Exactly. So this is the idea. Remember yesterday or last week, we talked about reading our data and updating that data. So everything was updated through event handlers, and we read that data, calling it this.state. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the component lifecycle, and this is going to make a lot more sense why I would do something about this or like this. But the component lifecycle would say that the first thing that happens when this component mounts, when this component gets triggered in a pre-render phase, so this is pre-render function call, this constructor is going to go and build out the state. So the first thing that happens is our constructor goes and builds out the state. It takes the props and it will build out state from those props that are passed to it. Then our render function would be called. So at the point that this render function is invoked, we have everything that's on state. And we can just read from that and create a comment for each comment in that array. Now, here's what's going to be fun. We're going to build out a comment input today, and that comment input will allow us to push new comments or potentially maybe delete comments if you wanted to add that functionality. It's not part of the MVP, but if it would allow us to add new comments to this array directly. Okay, and if we're reading from state instead of props, we have separated out our components data chain. Because remember, app at this point holds on to state. I'm just gonna put this array, okay? It's passing that down through the chain from component to component. So app passes it to the post container, PC, which then iterates over that array and generates a new post for each item in that array, okay? And then the post generates a comment section for each comment. I'll just put com, okay? So now, instead of having to go all the way back up the props chain, loop through this entire state data, and then add comments to that, find an object by a certain ID, find that object, and then push the item into that, and then it would go and force a re-render to all of these components. We're simply just going to separate the comments array into the state of comments, and then we'll just push directly into that. So it's a little bit easier of an algorithm, and we don't have to deal with this passing handlers and functions around our state tree. Okay, so you're discovering right now, what I'm mapping out to you right now is some of the inherent problems that come from the React built-in state management system. Some of those problems are data flows top down. Events can bubble up, events can trickle up the train. As you pass event handlers down, you can invoke them from the bottom. But that gets a little bit difficult, right? We don't need to go through that whole process of updating what's found on our great-great-grandparent, right? Or what is this? Grandparent, great-grandparent component. So in this case, what we would do is just separate those comments out as their own state and then manage that state from here, right? And then pass that handler down only one function, call set state, render gets reinvoked, and we're just managing it. But on initial page load, we need some comments. So when we mount this component, we're going to pass these comments down as props, and our initial state will be comments derived from the props.comments. Okay? Is any of that tripping any of you up at this point, or was that pretty clear as to why I chose that architectural path? Are there any questions about what I chose to do there? Okay. All right, cool. So that was my day one. Everything else was just kind of styling, putting the application together to make it look like, okay, yeah, Ryan's kind of moving along. He's getting these Instagram clones. Nothing is functional, like this doesn't work and this doesn't really work, but it's generating at least something, right? And it's kind of printing data onto the screen. You were given a data set, and you were told to get pretty much this far today. Don't feel bad if you didn't. This afternoon, the first thing that I want you to do is to reference the day one solution and try and get your project to the day one task list complete. And then you'll move on and you'll start adding comment functionality. There's a whole list of fun things to do today that deal with what we're going to talk about right now. Okay. All right. Before we dive into today's topic, Does anyone have any questions for me? Nothing at all. You're all just eager to learn about the component life cycle, what it is in React, how it's going to work, what's going to happen. Okay, let's see here really quick. So we were supposed to make our comment section into a class instead of a constant. Is it going to be hard to change that? Actually, Keith, no. That's a very good question. I'm going to start sharing my screen again because I stopped because I was refactoring some stuff. And okay, so the answer came in. Why would you use the class component? Well, I'm using the class component so that I can have state. Okay, and my approach to building React components, my approach is that I I always start with a functional stateless component. I always start with the const foo, takes in props, returns an element, because it is so much easier to refactor a stateless functional component into a stateful class component. Were we supposed to be able to come up with making comment section a class component on your own? No. So let me show you where I got that from. I'm showing you this now. But if you look, there is a step inside of day 2 README. In app.js, blah, 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 hold on. Adding comments. Let's divide up the data that we've been working with this far by separating comments array onto a new component state. Pass down the comments through each post to the comment section component. Be sure that you set the incoming comments props data on the state of the comments component. Okay, so this is part of something you're going to be doing today. Okay, I chose to do it yesterday as part of yesterday's thing because I knew where this was going. Okay, and so then you'll have your comment section, add new comment that takes an event, an index. You're going to just work in this fashion. So it's part of your daily steps today. So Charlie, don't worry too much about that. Okay. Kyle and Grant are asking about the I in a map function. So inside of a map array, if I have an array of item 1, item 2, this is good practice, and I say .map over that, this is going to generate a new array of items based on the array that we give it. But for each item, this callback that we write takes in the item itself and the index where that item is found. So that's how the map function is built. You can add these two parameters to this callback function, and then at the time that these parameters become arguments, the first argument will be this and 0. Then the second argument will be this and 1. So if I were to console.log for each item in this array, just simply console.log item and index, you'll see that we get item number 1 is index 0, item number 2 is index 1, right? So that's what the I represents. You'll commonly see this. You'll commonly see element and index. If you ever see that, you'll know, oh, that first one is the element in that array, and the next one is the index. You can use index as a key. I think React will give you some soft warning saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. Cool. All right. Any other questions? In fairness, I did ask for questions to come in. Okay, let's jump right in then. Today we're talking about the component lifecycle in a React component. So when you think about a lifecycle, you think about maybe just all life, all living things, right? So the life cycle of a typical like living organism is essentially we have a birth, okay? And then we have some sort of growth into maturity and inevitable death, right? So that is the meaning of life. I hate to break it to you. Not the meaning of life, but that's just how all life works, right? We have, every living organism, is born or comes into existence, grows up into maturity, and then eventually dies, okay? Unless you can figure out otherwise how to prolong that process. Soon, Charles is on the case. Okay, so that's the idea, is that not only do all living things have an existence, right? Software also goes through a similar process. All applications have, elements that follow the same pattern. So in UI applications, often we see that we first get started with our application. Our application boots up. Okay, that's what we consider birth. Users interact with an application, meaning the state changes, the application matures, things grow, and then eventually the application is closed or navigated away from, and that application dies, right? The software is not in necessarily memory anymore, okay? So the idea here is that software is akin to life, right? Software has a life, has a pattern of birth, growth, and death, okay? So not all UI systems enable like a lifecycle pattern, right? React does, right? It doesn't mean that React is necessarily superior to all other UI systems. It just means that we have a little bit more control when working with React, okay? So all a lifecycle does within a UI system is provide us a specific order of operations, or it provides us developers the ability to control or sort of craft our code in a certain way so that we gain control or access of the pattern, okay? So as React developers, this not only happens at our global application level, but it also happens at the component level. So every single component in React has a life cycle, okay? And the only way to tap into that component life cycle is to extend the React component base class. So even if it's a functional component, it has a life cycle, but we don't have control over that life cycle until we turn a component into a class component. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, every single component goes through a phase, a birth phase or a mounting phase, okay? And that looks a lot like this. Not that far zoomed in, but like this, breaking the UI of our training kit. Okay, so every single mounting phase or birth phase is pretty much starts out where our constructor gets invoked. Okay, so let's assume that we're simply talking about class components at this point, because we want to tap into the component lifecycle. Okay, then what happens is during this what we call the mounting phase is that other methods will get invoked if they exist. Okay, so this weird sounding method, get derived state from props, this is actually new as of React 16.3 or 16, but don't worry about it right now. We're not concerned about this method at all. In fact, you may not ever need a use case for it here at Lambda School. Maybe in your within your capstone projects, okay? But for curriculum purposes, you don't need to know exactly what happens there, okay? I'll highlight the ones that you do need to understand and do need to know about it. But then look what happens here. Immediately after that that weird function would get invoked if it existed, invokes, we call render. Okay, so render is a lifecycle method. And get this, it's the only lifecycle method that is required, which is why we taught you to use it when building class components. It's a part of your CCR, right? Creating Clearwater Revival. Declare the class, call the constructor, and render your component. If render does not exist in a class component, you'll get an error. Plain and simple. There's no way to get UI to the screen if you don't have that render method. Okay? So its job is to simply return out HTML or JSX really. And then that JSX gets delivered to the reconciler and turns into HTML at some point. Okay, but after that, in the mounting phase, what happens is React will then go and put something on the screen. It'll update the DOM. And then should it exist, this really cool component called component did mount would be fired. Remember, all of these will only trigger or only be fired if you physically type them out in your component. It's not like under the hood, get derived state from props is being called and invoked if it's not there on the component class, okay? If we have a method called component did mount, it will get fired directly after we actually mount the component to the DOM, okay? Now, the best, and we're going to cover all of these at length, but the best way to think about component did mount is anytime that you have some sort of operation that produces side effects or mutates your state or something, you would perform that operation inside of component did mount. What do I mean by that? Well, anytime that you have an operation that needs to call an API and retrieve some sort of data across the World Wide Web, there is going to be a moment of time where you do not have that data. So React is going to go continue on to do its thing. And then once you have that data, you call set state. Now, what happens when you call set state? Well, if this component lifecycle method were to exist, should component update would be called, but we don't need to care about that one either, okay? It's funny because all these things exist, but we're only going to concern ourselves with a couple of them. So as soon as we have finished calling component did mount, we have moved from mounting to updating because already we have mounted our app to the DOM as it should be, okay? So then what happens? In a mounting setting, in an updating setting, in this phase of our growth, right? This is like the growth. We get new props and can change state. So that's the idea here. Initially in mounting, we have our initial props and initial state. Then in updating, we get new props and new state potentially. Okay? This is where we handle user interactions. Anytime a user interacts with our component, it is growing up, it's maturing, it's updating in the life cycle. Okay? So what's interesting about updating is that mounting and unmounting, they only happen once for a component. Okay? Updating, however, can happen over and over and over again. So this is where we spend most of our time in a component lifecycle, is in the updating phase. Trevor, I'll answer your question in just a second. As soon as we call set state, eventually what's going to happen is render gets called. Now this component, should component update, if it just simply returns true or false. And this is where we could say, hey, I don't want render to be called. So if false gets returned, then I'm not going to call render. But once again, we're not ever going to use this at Lambda School. So that's just what this little red X is simplifying. So return true, false. If it returns false, we're not going to call render, okay? But then set state will change the state, update our state, and then render gets invoked again, okay? So that's the part of the life cycle that we care about the most. And then if we navigate away from that page and mount and unmount another component, this component will unmount. Lifecycle hook will begin. So all of these are called lifecycle hooks, lifecycle methods. And there's plenty of documentation out there on them, and I can link you to some really cool articles that talk about all of this, that dissect this at length. I saw somebody had posted one earlier. I recommend looking into them as you continue along your journey in React. Okay. Trevor says, so component did mount and component did update are sort of like listeners. Yes. What they're listening for has to do with the phase in which the life cycle or the component's life cycle is in. So yeah, they listen for changes. So if you add them to your component, you get the opportunity to see them operate. Then Catherine says, if you were to directly change the state without set state, would it mount the component again? And therefore, why is it bad to do so? No. If you change the state without set state, you will not get a re-render. All re-renders will happen through the set state function, which is why you can't mutate or change your state. This is why React is so reactive, right? Because as soon as you call set state, you get a chance to re-render your component. Your component remounts to the screen. Okay. Any other questions about the component lifecycle? And yeah, Catherine, that's the way that the components were. That's the way that components were built in React. That's the way the React API was built. Was so that you could have direct control over how state gets updated. All right. So there are 3 component lifecycle methods that you need to be directly aware of as we continue out this week. So the 3 that I want you to memorize are 2 that you already know and have worked with: set state and render. Okay. Remember, render is required for all class components. If it's not there, you don't get your DOM elements that you want. Okay. The new one that we're going to learn about today is component did mount. So what happens when we mount a component and then component did mount gets triggered? That's what we're going to walk through and discuss this morning. Cool. I'll pause for another question or two. Because yeah, we just talked about a lot of stuff, but we haven't really put into practice anything yet. So I want to make sure that you, have what you need. Something's weird with my thing. So just to clarify, when a component updates, it does not unmount. Exactly. Yeah, so we go through the birth, the mounting phase, the growth and updating phase, and then the death, the unmounting phase. Mounting and unmounting only happen once. They're events that take place at the beginning or end. And then updating is the phase that we are most concerned with. Okay, good question. Catherine then asks, does the component unmount once the browser window is closed? Yeah. So yeah, virtually, or if you navigate to another page. So next week, Catherine, we're going to be talking about React Router. Okay. So and that has to do with URLs. So basically, that package allows us to mount a specific component based on the URL that we are, the path in our URL that we are currently at. So if you navigate away from that component, it will be unmounted. Okay. Or if you just need to destroy that component, mount one over the other, you could use like a ternary operator to do so. Which, for intents and purposes, that might actually be a fun little project I could put together and demo. I think that'd be cool. Okay, so what we have here is just a bare bones, bare minimum create React app application. And what I want you to do is take this application and see that people right here is an array. Okay, it's an array of people. And each person has, there's a lot of data here. Holy cow, I didn't realize there's this much. But each person has an ID, a first name, last name, email, gender, occupation, and a friends list, a list of friends with first and last names. Okay? What I want you to do is I want you to take this component, I want you to build out a constructor, okay? And in that constructor, well, first you're going to need to import, okay? In that constructor, I want you to set your people, this array, on a friends object called state. Or sorry, on a state object called friends that has a friends property. Okay? So set people as friends on this dot state. Okay, so that's it. That's all I want you to do for this. And it's only going to take you, I don't know, 4 minutes or so to achieve it. Here comes the link. Go ahead and jump into that code sandbox and use the constructor. Remember, the constructor is used in what phase of our component lifecycle? Let me ask that again. Within which phase is the constructor method used in our React component lifecycle? Mounting. Perfect. So go ahead and import in those people from people.js, build out your constructor, set the people as friends on this dot state. I'll give you 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll jam back. All right, you have 30 more seconds to give this a whack. I'm sure most of us got there. If you didn't, don't worry. We're going to solve it right now together. But yeah, Ash is right. People is a named export. Kind of briefly touched on that a couple days ago, a week ago or so. Okay, let's wrap this thing up. So our first goal was to import, and you would have had to do it the way that I posted in Slack, people from people. I have to do it this way because people is not a default object. It's actually named, so we're looking for a specific property on an object, which we can dive into at length at a different time. Okay, build out this constructor just the way that we know how. This app is not going to receive any props because it's the most parent component, so I don't care to pass props through the constructor. I just care to simply extend the component and make sure that I have access to it. Notice we're doing this up here, so I don't have to call React dot component. Okay? So it's just one of those little tricks. Now we set our state, okay? And we say that friends get people. Now let's take a peek. I'm going to open this up in a new window so that I can open up my Chrome DevTools. Always, 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 always go to your DevTools. Something went wrong here. There it goes. Okay. Always go to your React DevTools. That's why I had you download them. And then notice we have 51 records of people on our people object. I have seen cases where constructor is not called and state outside of a constructor. Is this a valid way of setting state? It seems to work as well. Yeah, so I did mention this in passing the other day, and it's good that you bring it up because with new React, we're talking about like stage 3 presets in Babel, so like futuristic JavaScript. So with us, we're using Create React Apps, so the most modern tools are available at our disposal. Okay, so we can call state like this because we're developers and we're lazy. Okay, a whole bunch of problems exist around this if you don't understand the constructor, which is why at Lambda School, at least until the end of this week, I have challenged everyone to ensure that their constructor exists. Okay, so, but that, let's go back. That is synonymous with this. We're developers, we're lazy, we're gonna make compilers do work for us. So this and this are 100% equivalent, okay? In fact, under the hood, what's going on is the constructor is gonna be thrown back into this code at one point. To Ash's point, yes, if I was to try and do this in the browser without Babel, we'd probably get some massive errors because it's futuristic JavaScript, which is why I'm saying, hey, do this for now until you completely understand the constructor method. Once the week is over, once you're done working on React for 2 weeks, if you so choose to do so, go ahead, throw your state around like that. You're going to have to learn how props work without a constructor though. Because with a constructor, we get the props for free, like this. Without the constructor, you have to explicitly, statically set your props, which is kind of a weird thing that we don't need to go into, we don't need to explore for right now. Essentially, what's going on is people are trying to make JavaScript look and feel a lot more like Java. That's just my hunch. It's not really true, but there's some features of the Java language that are, I mean, that's kind of where JavaScript derived its name. It was a popular language. Java was a popular language at the time JavaScript was built. So due to its popularity and sort of familiar syntax with a couple of things, Brendan Ike and team at Netscape eventually put the name JavaScript together. But the two languages couldn't be more different. That's funny. Oracle owns the copyright. Cool. Kyle says, I feel like I've seen examples online where the most parent component is still being fed props in the constructor and super. Is there any reason to do this? Well, if we were to do that, let's see. Let's see if React gives us anything that we're unaware of under the hood. Really, nothing. It's just an empty object. So in my head, there's no reason to do it. Well, if it's coming from an index, then this would probably be a parent or a child component, right? So yeah, that's a good question. I wanted to see if there was something that I was missing that React was giving me, but I was 90% sure it wasn't. So yeah, cool. This is the birth. Our component can be born to the screen. Okay. What has to happen for this to work is that initially when we set up our constructor, our state is being set and defined on that first phase in the life cycle. So the constructor gets set up. Okay. And then we would have that get derived state from props called. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to, so before we even iterate over this list of people and display them to the page, like in maybe a p tag like this or something, what we're going to do is we're actually going to write a component did mount function. Okay. And just watch, don't try and follow along at this point. We're going to simply just put a couple of console logs here, just so we can see the mounting phase and then the post mounting phase, the post render phase. And we're going to console log, and then we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll finish our discussion. Okay. So I'm going to put a console.log here inside of this component did mount. I'm going to say CDM invoked. We're going to see who invokes it. And then inside of render, I'm going to say render invoked, so that we know exactly what happens at which phase in the life cycle. And inside of our constructor, just after super, I'm going to console.log constructor invoked. And I'm going to actually console.log to this keyword. Because we've called super, we now have access to this keyword. So, and these would all have access to, but just wanted something there to see why we would log that, right? Now, if we look at the console, well, let me save. Okay, constructor was invoked. So there are two apps listening right now, that browser and this one. Let me just refresh that page. Okay. Let's see here. For some reason, we are getting two renders of this component. So don't worry. I think maybe the tests, yeah, it's probably the test rendering. Let's see why. I'm curious as to why that's happening. There we go. The test was re-rendering our component. Okay. So yes, constructor is invoked. We have this keyword, which is our app. Okay. Notice that props are an empty object. State, at the time that the constructor method was invoked, already has friends on it, which is awesome. Okay. Then we invoke render. Then we invoke component did mount. And this is the process. If we go back to that lifecycle method, we are proving that this works. Constructor, render, component did mount. Cool. Before we go on break, the question came in, will we be going over refs in the future? We won't cover refs. Refs is a low-level, commonly used API, but the use case is just not there for what you need to know at React. And then right before we go on break, the question is, what is component did mount actually doing? Well, it's being invoked after our render function gets invoked. So yes, when we come back, why is this phase in the birth mounting phase so important? What do we use it for? What is the meaning of life, Charles? Of the birth and mounting of a component. We'll get there when you get back. Stay tuned. Okay, let's take a 7-minute break because we have been chatting for a while. So please physically walk away from your computer, look elsewhere, go grab a drink of water. I meant to say 7-minute timer. Come back, and we'll jam out. We'll talk to you just a minute. Okay. Sorry, it's a little bit late back from the break. Okay. So before we went on break, the question came up of why we even have component did mount in the first place. What is it actually doing? What's its purpose? Trevor answered a hint or his assumption. He says he thinks he can make our component do stuff after the page loads, or rather after the component mounts. It can be asynchronous. Well, component did mount is actually synchronous, but we'll talk about that. That's what I'm saying, kind of like a listener, I think. Yeah. So here we go. Good inclination. You are not far off at all, Trevor. You are very, very close. Okay. Component did mount. In fact, all the lifecycle methods besides set state will behave synchronously, meaning they will be called in the order every single time by which they are supposed to be called. The React engine goes and does something like this, since we love drawing today. Essentially, every single time is this component is invoked or component is rendered, right? We have a question mark that the React engine asks itself. It says, does that method exist, right? So if it's true, if it does exist, then it knows exactly when to call it. Same thing with the rest of the methods. If they exist, if they're written in our component, they know the React engine knows when to go and call them, okay? And they all happen to be called at a specific place in time. So it is synchronous. The idea here, however, is that when we mount our component, render is called, we get some stuff mounted to the screen. We then have a function that will be immediately invoked after the render function. So why is this method in the birth mounting phase so important? Okay, well, let's learn what this method is about, learn some rules that sort of govern what this method can and cannot do. So it's only invoked once, ever, okay? It'll only be called at one point during the mounting phase. Yeah, Will, I guess you could think of it as like a window on load. But it's the on load would actually be more like this, to be honest, because yeah, I guess the window would have to load. If the window on load was loading the entire window before it invokes this function, then yes, your question is correct. Or the answer to your question is yes. Okay. It's only invoked once ever after the render method mounts its JSX to the DOM. Okay. So it only gets called one time ever. So what are some things you can do? What are some things to do then? Okay. The answer to that is any async operations, which is where Trevor was leaning to. Okay. Anytime you need to call and fetch for some data, so say we have a server. Anytime you need to make an HTTP request, which we're learning all about next week, TTP, to a server, and communicate with that server, any async operations like that can be handled inside of component did mount. What else? Well, let's say that we're mounting this app and we need to mount some specific DOM listeners directly accessing the event listener object on the DOM. So adding any DOM event listeners that one may need. So what have I done in regards to that? On component did mount, what I have done is I have added a resize listener that listens for the window to resize, okay? Then when the window gets to a certain width, so I've basically added my own media queries. So kind of a really interesting thing there. Is render then hoisted? No. Well, no. It just gets invoked at certain places and times. It's not like this is going to be read top to bottom. It's just that this method will be there. It's just going to be in existence on the app. So it's not like it's getting hoisted. Okay. You guys ask deep questions. I think one way to think of it is to pretend the method is written at the bottom of the page. You can just syntactically write it after the render function. Disclaimer, this might be completely wrong. I think you're completely right. Normally, the last function you see in a React object, React component, the last function you see will always be the render function, just by convention. It's because that's what we concern ourselves with. That's what's actually going to be rendered. Okay. So you'll usually see this at the top of the page, like this, at the top of the component, because it's dealing with initializer data in the birth of the component. Okay. So the idea is that as soon as that component did mount function is invoked, what can you do to control the updating process? Okay, so what's our updater function that we have access, or that gives us access to changing the data in our application? What's our famous updater function that we use to, yeah, set state. So you can call set state, which then what happens? As soon as we invoke set state, render is going to be called again. So let's check it out. Let's say that initially mounting is false. Component did mount calls set state, and we change mounting to true. And for kicks and giggles, we're gonna render out our state inside of our render method. Constructors invoked. Okay, render is invoked. Mounting is false. Friends is what it should be because we initialize that in the constructor. Component did mount is invoked. Because we called set state, render is invoked again. Now mounting is true. I should say mounted. Let's do that. Or let's say CDM called, because in truth we have mounted our component already. So render invoked, CDM is false. CDM invoked, render invoked, CDM called is true. Pretty nifty, right? So if I wanted to have this be an empty array, okay, and on component did mount, set that data as friends gets people, this is where I would want to do that. Because we're assuming, in this case, it's not where I'd want to do that. I'd probably just pass it in like this and put it on the friends property. But we're assuming we're building the bigger picture here. We're assuming that people does not live in our application. We're assuming that people lives on a server somewhere else. Okay? And then we just simply invoke, we do our async function, our AJAX request, and we invoke and grab that get the friends and send them back. My question to you is, you've actually worked in code that has done that before. Who remembers which project this was set up in? That exact paradigm. Yeah, the React Wars application. We fetched for some data across the World Wide Web in component did mount. And it went, and after that data was returned, it then went and set state on our constructor. We did not have that data initially. It didn't live inside of our project like people, okay? So here's the assumption. Component did mount. Here's the ruling, what we want it to do. is really, really good for asynchronous operations, for fetching data that you would need when you're loading your page, okay? So what I want you to do now is actually from that same project that you had just worked on, make sure that you are calling set state and setting your friends equal to your people object, okay? Just to simulate this idea of fetching for data, because that's where you would do it every single time, is inside of component did mount, okay? So go ahead and take 3 minutes and do that. Set up your component did mount function. You can add the console logs like mine if you want, but make sure you call set state to set that friend's data. Okay? We'll now give you 2 minutes to do so because it's pretty trivial. I didn't realize the timer had gone off. I was looking ahead at what we're gonna talk about next. Okay. All right, gang. The way to solve this is to simply say that friends now gets people. And if we keep our console logs the way that we had them, the original time that renders invoked, friends is 0, empty array, and the next time friends has those components, those items, okay? And we initialize friends to an empty array here at first. Question for you is, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to initialize it to an empty array? And the answer to Trevor's question about the then business is yes, Trevor. That's what that was all about in that project. But yeah, why would I want to initialize this array as an empty array when in my constructor? What does that do for me? Well, one thing you may not know is you can call .map on an empty array. Okay. Yeah, so I can change it. So if I'm going to pass this data down, there's one point in time where I don't have this data. This is actually going to be a defined array object that I can use, right? So I can say empty array.map, and I'm not going to get an error. Otherwise, I would get errors. Okay. All right. So some things to remember. I'm just looking ahead at this afternoon's assignment, and I'm trying to make sure that we're all, pretty much good to go. I don't want to give away everything because there's a lot of good value in like building out the search functionality and liking posts. Adding comments is akin to your to-do list. So it's going to be the same type of thing. You type into an input field, hit enter, it adds a comment to that array. Okay. And the stretch problems for the day are, we actually kind of talk about data persistence in local storage tomorrow. So, okay. So let's do this. Let's talk about the filter function. Okay. Because filtering is very important, and it's a big part of one of your pieces of the assignment today. So we have this array of items, and filtering over that array of items, we have one array. So let's look at filter really quick. What does filter do? If I had an array, cool, equals 1, 2, 3, and I wanted to filter out the odd items of this array. So I wanted to get a new array. Probably don't want to capitalize that. Odd items equals myArray.filter, right? So I know you've practiced with this, but let's just refresh your memory on what goes on here. So we're gonna say that for each item in this array, which they're gonna be numbers. So just like with map, number and index, right? Or item and index would be the two things you can pass to your filter function. There's other things as well, but don't worry about them. For now, we're just gonna simply pass number to our callback. And then we're gonna pass a truth test. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. Okay. Then we're gonna give this a truth test, a truth conditional check. We're gonna say only return, so there's an implicit return right here. But if we were to type this out, we would say return if, right, item is thing. So we'll just use the implicit return. And we're gonna say return if item is odd, okay? So how do I check, or if number is odd? How do I check if a number is odd? The question came in, what would the username for the comment be? I thought about the comment stretch, and we are using dummy username. Just pick one on your own, okay? You can use anon. Yeah, John's, that's right. It just says to explicitly pass it in. Okay, so if return our number if our number passes this check. If we're divisible by 2 and it does not equal 0. So that's kind of what we want to do there, okay? So we're going to say if number is divisible by 2, so modulus 2, and it does not equal 0. That means it cannot be divided in half evenly, right? Which is what would indicate that the remainder would be 0, which is even, okay? So then, if I look at odd items, we should get the 1 and the 3, okay? So that's how you would use filter, but notice, we have untouched the original array, which is going to be very important when implementing your search functionality. You're going to use something like this, okay, to filter out based on an indicator. Maybe if a string includes a sequence of numbers, do some regex searching, or includes, whatever. I'm hinting too much, I think. But this now is a new array, which we would then want to set on state. Okay? And we want to leave this one unscathed because your logic is going to say pass the original given comments or posts, okay, or the filtered posts. Pass the filtered posts if the array on filtered posts is greater than 0. So that's kind of your dirty logic there, just to remind you, just to point you in the right direction, because that last time, that tripped up a lot of people when they got to the search portion. So I'm expecting you guys to be much more prepared for this. But I just want to make sure that you've kind of seen that before. I know you have seen filter before, and you've worked with it because I wrote that curriculum that Josh taught you. So there are filter, map, and reduce practices in the curriculum. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. If something changed, I'm unaware of it. But this should not be the first time any of you have seen filter. And filter's really, really good for search functions on the front end. Okay. Some other things that you can take this now, you can play around with, is you can set your state with that data, the friends data, and notice that the friends data is a lot like our post data. So if you want to, you could then pass your friends around and play around with that data as well to get some more practice with things before you dive right in. Okay. You did higher order functions in the first JS week? Awesome. Yeah, callback functions, passing around functions as arguments. Cool. Glad to know that filter is still a part of the idea. All my days have become one. Awesome. Okay. Kyle asked, just to be clear, you wouldn't only use set state within component did mount. No, only when you're so you can use set state in any updating component, any type of handler. Okay, we used it in set state so that you could see that it will get invoked, and then set state will invoke a render again. So that was kind of the process there. You can use set state all over your application. The important thing to delineate is that we wanted some initializer data, like our friends set as people, and we use set state to achieve that. So it is often used in real life to grab data like you did with CDM. Yep, that is 99% of the main purpose of component did mount, is to fetch data and set it on state. Set up event listeners initially when your component mounts. Okay, any other questions about the component lifecycle? So remember, the reminder about the week is that we're learning only a couple of tidbits of new things each week, or each day this week. So really minor, small adjustments to the stuff that you already know, okay? Everything else that you know can be used to implement this project. So if you look at the day 2 README, for what is required for you, let's just dive in. So the idea here is that you're going to focus on the component lifecycle, some of the major lifecycle methods of render and component did mount. Your daily setup, you should have a working app with a component tree that is set up kind of like this. So this is not a design spec, but note that app controls our data. We have a search bar component, post container, comment section. So each one of these would have a post inside the post container. Okay. Your data should be imported into app.js and then passed as props to post container. Each post, so this is your checklist. If you didn't have these things put together, try and put them together before you dig in this afternoon. Okay, and I'm going to set you free early this morning so that you can work on this, so you can go and implement these ideas right away. So then props is being passed around to each component, and it should be type checked using prop types and default props if you feel like you need default props. The comment section should add a comment to the post. So this actually is part of day 2, so this actually should not be in there. So I need to go and update the README here. For this part of the project, you're going to use the React Lifecycle methods to get data and render the components. Then you will use functions passed as props to build out the functionality more. As data comes into the component, you will set it to the component state, then pass it down to the child components. Add the functionality to the add a comment to any of the posts, which is funny that it's right here. But I guess this is just saying the comment section should display your comments. All right. Implement the ability to like a post by clicking the heart icon and having the number of likes increment accordingly. You could make this little flashy with a little animation where the heart swaps and changes from hollow to full, and then limit the amount of likes a person can give. That's not part of the MVP. The MVP is just to increment every single time it's clicked, which is kind of fun. Get the search bar to filter posts by the post username. Okay. So the tasks for day 2, component lifecycle methods, a follow through on how to add comments, liking your posts, and search bar. If you don't have your application set up like this yet, these tasks are going to be pretty difficult. So I want to make sure that you start there this morning and you dive right in before lunch. Okay. And then stretch problems, you pretty much for all stretch problems, you're kind of on your own. PMs, myself, can help out a little bit, but the point of the stretch problem is, oh, you've reached MVP. How do you push yourself even further? Okay. Yeah, so Kyle asked if we're going to be going over more about the methods of updating and unmounting later on. Yeah, so for us, the only updating method we need to know at Lambda School is called set state. Okay, the component will unmount method is not important as well. So, but I will come up with a demo at some point, probably next week, or I'll have Dustin do it next week to show you guys how that works. Cool. It says localhost here. Do you mean local storage? Yeah, that should be local storage. So this is the local storage API. You'll learn how to work with that if you get to that stretch problem. Good catch, Ash. Cool. Any questions before I let you go for the remainder of the morning? I'm sure that there's very few of you that would complain that we cut our lecture short and you got a chance to dive right back into your project. Jordan asked if we want to write inline JavaScript like an if statement, if this.state.search does not equal empty string, where will I put that? So I'm assuming you're talking about the search functionality. So remember, inside of JSX, you can write a ternary operator that checks to see if some value is true, or dot length. So dot length is greater than 0, right? Would be your logic, but in this case, just some value is true. Mount that p tag, else mount null. So right now, that p tag went away. If I change some value to a truthy statement, truthy value, empty string, not truthy, cool. Is 8 truthy? Yes. Okay. In this case, it's true. Our p tag mounts. Let me refresh the page again. Our p tag mounts because it's true. If I change it back to false, it's false. Cool. So yeah, you do it inside of ternary statements. This could be indicative of another component or JSX element. Cool. So that's the idea. Filtered items, searched items. Your filtered items would be an array. And if that array's length is greater than 0, mount or pass certain items around. I'm not going to give you much more than that because that's the whole logic of the problem. Cool. Any other questions before I let you go? what I can do is I'll just I'll make myself available. You can just DM me if you have any questions about anything, and the rest can jump right into the project and sort of pick up where you left off yesterday, trying to get to this, right? Except for this last one, don't worry about the comment section. Just you'll be walked through the process. This is really fun. Like each bullet gives you enough information, not everything, but enough information to kind of figure out. So the idea here, what you're learning to do is to read the manual, right? 99% of the time in the field, that's the best skill that you can have as a developer, is how do I read the freaking manual, RTFM, okay? All right, no more questions. I'm just gonna stop talking and let you guys go to work. Have fun. Please let me know if you need anything all around this morning and pretty much this afternoon if you need anything escalated to myself. Thanks so much for tuning in.